Welcome, brave listeners, to Wilhelm Presents Frightening Tales. I'm your host, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark and creepy tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from all over this world. If you're an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 120 episodes of previous content. We are so very near the end of the season, where I will take a short break to collect another series of dark stories for Season 6. So please, don't hesitate to share your writing like today's episode, which was written by Rob Morton. Now, Rob hasn't shared much about himself, if anything, other than the fact that he claims this story is 100% true. He calls this dark tale the fucking dirt bike story. This story took place somewhere around the winter of 1983. I was 10 years old and my cousin Jeremy was 9. We were at his house, not mine, and my aunt had gone out for the evening. We'd already had dinner and were just screwing around when my older cousin Brian came home around 7. Now, we were wary of him because, well, he was nuts. Nuts in a volatile, punchy kind of way. He was also 15 and already 6 feet tall. Brian came home with his newest foray into how to piss off every adult he'd ever met. He had him a dirt bike. It was a decent bike, not new nor fancy, but it wasn't dinged and scratched like some. Brian went on and on about the deal he got on the bike and his plans on where he would ride it. It smelled like grease and sweat, like all dirt bikes. It had a red gas tank and most of the rest was chrome. However, at 7 p.m. in Massachusetts, in winter, meant that it was dark out. It was also snowing. Nothing crazy, but enough to shovel by the next day. Brian, the fucking stable genius he was, realized that there was no space in the garage for the bike, until he spent at least an hour moving shit. So he announced his intention to store the bike in the dining room on the old side of the house. A bit of an explanation here. When I said I was at my cousin's house, it was important because their house was similar but different from mine. I lived about a half mile up the same road, right on Main Street. They were both very old houses, as were most of the houses on that street. The original structures for both homes had been built when Massachusetts was still a British colony. They were also both very big houses, with the entire structures being around 4,000 square feet, not counting the cellars. They had both been subdivided and partially rented out. The home I lived in was mostly ours, with a second much smaller apartment on one side. My cousin's house was divided right down the middle, and they only rented the right half of the house. If you were looking at it from outside the front door, the left side of the house was referred to as the old side. It had been maintained and restored to how it had been furnished and decorated in a style called antebellum. I don't know what that meant then, but it was all old looking, and we were expressly forbidden from going over there. You can imagine how much we cared about that rule, being the bunch of feral massholes that we were. There was a door from the new kitchen that led to the old dining room, which then went on to the rest of that side of the house. There was a key to the door hanging on a nail next to it, an actual skeleton key. Sometimes we picked the lock with the tiny feet of action figures, but usually we left it the hell alone. One of the other common features between their house and mine was that, well, they were both clearly, indisputably haunted. My house was a cold spot, random shit falling off tables and shelves, occasional creepy whispers where no one was kind of haunted. Their place was much more poltergeisty and scarier, especially when we went dicking around on the old side of the house, like the old dining room, where my cousin Brian was about to store his wet, used dirt bike. We begged him to find another place for the bike because we knew that would increase the odds of the house acting up, as we referred to it. Brian invited us to go fuck ourselves, saying I'm not leaving my bike out in that snow. He then wheeled the bike into the house through the back door, which was the door we always used to come and go. The other doors were all to the old side, through the kitchen and into the old side dining room. The dining room was huge. I know, I was 10 and perspective shifts over time, but it had a large 10-seat dining room table along with several china cabinets, and there was plenty of room left. It was probably around 20 by 30 feet. I'd been told that everything in this room was super expensive and irreplaceable. I later found out that the table alone was worth around $2,000. At the time when gas was 30 cents a gallon and $3 would get you a large one-topping pizza with change coming back. Brian put the bike next to the outside wall of the dining room, just inside the doorway from the kitchen. Then he went and got a towel to wipe it down. He showed it off to us, let us touch it, and then ask questions for a bit, and then he announced that he was going back out to hang out with his druggy friends. He admonished us to not touch the bike while he was gone. More specifically, he said, "Now if I get back and find out either of you have been touching my bike, you'll both be pissing blood tomorrow." Then, having exhausted his supply of charm and tact, he left. We waited a good 10 minutes before we went over to look at the bike again. We touched it, flipping the bird in Brian's general direction, snickering and derping like the kids we were. I took careful note of how he had placed the bike. It was next to a dining room window, facing back towards the new kitchen, with the kickstand facing out into the room, so that the bike was leaned away from the wall. Neither of us actually got on it because it was a full-sized bike, and we were miniature delinquents. But we spent a few minutes looking it over before we went back to our side and locked the door. About a half hour later, we were playing with matchbox cars in the kitchen when we heard a loud crash from the other side of the door. I'll be honest, this illustrated the worst part of living in a haunted house. After long enough, it just kind of faded into the background info we all use without thinking on it much. At that point, we knew the bike had fallen over, but the only concern we had was putting it back up so as to avoid bodily harm. We took down the skeleton key, unlocked the door, and opened it. The light switch for the dining room was a very old-style push-button switch with 2 buttons. One was sticking out and the other was pressed in. You pushed the button that was sticking out in, and the one that had been in popped out. I reached around the corner, entering the room, and hit the button. There was the bike, lying on the floor with the kickstand folded up under it. I figured that maybe the kickstand was loose, or that Brian hadn't locked it open. We picked up the bike, redeployed the kickstand, gave it a shake, and went back to our side. The only fear involved was the ass beating we'd just avoided. It was about 15 minutes later when we heard the bike fall again. At that point, we started to grow concerned that the house was acting up, after all. But we were also concerned about how good our local ER was at treating internal injuries. We unlocked the door again, and it opened slowly, apprehensively. There was the bike, on the floor just like last time, demonstrating the kind of cognitive dissonance unique to people who coexist with the supernatural. We were still hoping that this was a case of a bad kickstand. After some rather vulgar debate, we decided to turn the bike around so it would be leaning in towards the wall, with the kickstand propped against the wall runner. We decided that we would have a better chance of explaining why the bike was moved if it was at least upright. If Brian came home and found it crashed on the floor, he might just start swinging instead of asking questions. We shook it to make sure it was stable, and then we left. It was already starting to feel different over there, like cold static electricity that was just shy of sparking. I distinctly remember hanging the key up on the nail, thinking that I hoped we wouldn't need it again. Not 10 minutes later, we heard the bike fall over again. Now, we knew that this was the house acting up. Something, whatever the hell it was, didn't like the bike being there. We still, however, had to account for Brian. Ghosts did not put us in the trunks of friends' cars and go for a ride when they were mad at us. Brian had done that to each of us at least once. So this time I grabbed a flashlight, because I didn't want to reach into a dark room to hit that light switch. We unlocked the door. Then Jeremy opened it as I lit the flashlight. There was the bike, on the floor, again. I noted with pants-shitting alacrity that the kickstand was sticking straight up in the air, and that the bike had fallen over from greater than 90-degree angle. This was clearly not where gravity met stupidity. This was us in conflict with a ghost. At that point, our fear of the house was on level with our fear of our psychotic relations. So we quickly formed a plan. We stood the bike up again with the bike leaning into the wall with the kickstand up against the floor runner board or whatever the fuck it's called. This time, I went and got a chair from the dining room set and pushed it up against the bike, pinning it towards the wall. The room felt weirder and weirder, to the point where we both remembered our ears popping like we were driving up into some mountains. We hustled out of the room and closed and locked the door as quick as we could. The shit hit the fan not 2 minutes after we locked the door. This time, however, we didn't hear the crash of a bike. What we heard was a loud, long, hissing noise that went on for thousands of years. That's how it felt. In reality, it was about 3 seconds, followed by a brief silence. I'm not saying that it sounded like the ghost of a 10,000-pound saber-toothed tiger, but I'm not saying it didn't either. Jeremy and I were standing in the middle of the kitchen, grabbing each other by the shirts and yelling, "What the fuck? What the fuck was that?" repeatedly at each other, until we heard another crashing sound. This sounded different, like it was from further away from the door than where we'd left the bike. What followed was a learned, scholarly debate between two perfectly rational grade schoolers. Me: "Fuck you, you go look. It's your house." Jeremy: "Fuck you, you go look, you're older." This went on for several minutes. At first, we had no intention of opening the door again, but the specter of gas leaking from the tank and into the floor was a legitimate concern. So, we eventually ended up at the door again. Jeremy had the key and would open the door. I had the flashlight. Jeremy turned the key, held his breath, and opened the door. I had already turned on the flashlight and had no intention of sticking my hand around a corner. We were both on the verge of hyperventilating. It was all gone. The bike and the chair, simply not there. We stared at the spot where the shit was supposed to be. Then I slowly lifted the flashlight to see across the room. There, in the far doorway on the other side of the dining room, was the chair I'd used to prop the bike. I distinctly remember a two-part response to this realization. Part of my brain was relieved, thinking, oh, the hissing noise was just the chair sliding across the floor. The more logical part of my brain countered with some version of, and that's the good news? Also, where the fuck is the bike? At this point, I started slowly bringing the flashlight right to left, looking for the bike. It wasn't under or behind the dining room table. It wasn't on the table, and it wasn't on the ceiling over the table. Yes, I looked there. It made about as much fucking sense as anything else. I developed a method for scanning the room while keeping as much of myself out of the room as I could. I remembered thinking that cops on TV would peek their heads quickly but completely around a corner for a scan of the room, but I was not doing that. I found out later that my technique was referred to as wedging the pie, and is basically how real cops and soldiers enter rooms. As I looked throughout the room, finding no bike, I had to peek my head out a little to see to my far left, towards the front of the house. I had the flashlight propped against the doorframe, pivoting like I was aiming a gun. When my flashlight beam got to the doorway on that side that led to a small front parlor, I could see the bike. It was in the middle of that room, on its side, kickstand still sticking up like a middle finger from beyond. I looked at the bike for a couple of seconds, said,
"Nope,"
and we closed and locked the door. We hung the key back on the nail and retreated to the living room on the far side of the new side of the house. We turned on the TV and turned the volume way up, lighting every light switch we had. Brian came home around 11. My aunt had already called to say she was staying at her boyfriend's house for the night, and we told her none percent of this, and we met him at the back door. Me. Before you say a fucking word, you need to go over tomorrow and move that bike. Before we went on to explain what had happened as described previously, to show how clearly manifestly haunted this house was, when the crazy giant teenager, who was now also higher than Giraffe Pussy, found out his bike had been so moved, he said, "I'll go over and get it tomorrow." Fucking right, you'll wait till tomorrow. Nobody's going over there again tonight. The next day, he did go over. He got the bike out and found space for it in the garage. If anyone is interested in learning more about that house, I've got other stories. I'll say this, though. That house was part of the Underground Railroad during the Civil War, and not everyone made it out.
Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me today. Please join me again next week for another frightening tale, or listen to one of more than 100 previous episodes. If you enjoyed your time here, please support my work. If you've been watching on YouTube, like the episode and subscribe to the channel. If you've been tuned in on Apple Podcast, please rate the channel as you see fit. And if you've been listening to the program on Spotify, I'd love to hear your comments. Most of all, share frightening tales with those around you and support today's authors however you can. Until next time, when I share with you another frightening tale, listen if you're brave enough.